Okay, thank you very much, Owen, for those kind words. And first of all, again, to compliment the Marxist reading group, I think it's absolutely fantastic. I think that our universities have been taken over by neoliberal maniacs, and when you find a sociology department, who's actually, well, this could never happen in my sociology department, to have such a conference, it is really brilliant. So I think it's a sign, really, of what's changing in this country, and I think that left-wing ideas are being taken seriously. And what I really want to argue in this talk is that we are living in a country, really, that, if you like, is a polar opposite to Greece and to France. Ireland is held up as the model of what should not happen to you if you're living, for example, in Britain, and you want to talk about the cuts and how it's not going to help British society. You will often, as a left-winger, point to Ireland as, if you like, the place you don't want to go. So we have a tremendous responsibility as people on the left, and I think that therefore we need to analyse the crisis, but analyse it really to come to some conclusions about what needs to be done, because I think that the role that Marxists can play in the coming years in Ireland will be a tremendous role. Now, let's start therefore with Brian Cowan. So Brian Lenihan. This is Lenihan in April 2009 speaking to the Irish League of Credit Unions, I think, in Athlone. And obviously, he's getting a bit of hammering at this stage, so he obviously needs a little bit of ego boost. So he presents it this way, that he's talking essentially to his fellow members of the ruling elite across the world, saying, listen, look what we've pulled off here. If this was happening in France, and he's obviously been quite prophetic about it, there would have been riots, and we should add strikes on the street. And really, the Irish model, if you like, has had a certain fascination for the global elite. The global elite generally, faced with an economic crisis, are torn. Some of them want massive stimulus packages to save capitalism, to get it going again. But others, and that was, if you like, the majority tendency after the Wall Street crash some years ago, but some of them also looked at this outlier, which was Ireland, if you like, which was going the opposite direction, as I'll try to show in a minute. And those of you might have missed it, but in the, I think it was August of this year, Newsweek did its 10 great leaders, 10 great world leaders, and this is its headline, where Brian Cowan features as one of the 10 great world leaders. And you might say to yourself, how in God's name could this man feature as one of the 10 great world leaders? But the answer was, he was conducting, and didn't expel it out as explicitly as this, but I think this was the meaning. He's the great fiscal taskmaster. This man was conducting an experiment on his population that very few other governments in Europe, or indeed America, had tried to do, and therefore it was with some fascination that this Irish model was being looked at up to about August of this year. And I think what I want to start with is by looking at how strange what is actually happening in this country is. Because when you're living here for a long time and you don't look at it from the outside, you often, even after 2 years, begin to get used to what is happening here. So, in terms, first of all, of the figures, I mean, we live in a society where billions are now dropped casually around the place. Sorry, it wasn't 3 billion, it was 4 billion I meant to put into the banks. This sort of discourse is around the place. So we need maybe to situate what some of these figures mean. So let's take the issue of the Anglo bailout. 29 billion, or maybe another 6 billion, who cares? Maybe it's 35 billion, something in those billion area. What does that mean? Well, we can put it in very simple human terms. There are 700 million people on this planet who are starving. 26,000 children will die between this talk now and 24 hours' time. They will mainly die because this system, this horrible system, cannot supply those children with even water purification tablets. And in a sort of a twang of their conscience, I think about a year and a half ago, the G8 leaders met and decided to do something about world hunger. And the total package they came up with was 20 billion. Not even that has been delivered. Not even that has been delivered. 20 billion. So we're living in a country, in a crummy little bank called Anglo-Irish Bank, gets more money than all of the world's hungry. I mean, it is that insane what is happening in Ireland. If we look at the actual possible figures, and these are probably conservative figures, we're talking about the GNP of Ireland is about 130 billion. 130 billion, right? So about half of the country's economy. That means that all the work we do for 6 months, man, woman and child, let's assume we've returned to child labour, that is going to be used to pay for the bank bailout. Now, put that in a global context. Banking crises are not entirely unusual. In fact, they're becoming more common in the neoliberal era. There has been 3 times more banking crises in this latter phase, the phase of so-called globalization from the 70s and neoliberal globalization, than there was in the earlier phase of, if you like, the so-called golden age of capitalism. But if you examine those crises, what you find, the general pattern is for banks to offload their debt onto society, to make society pay for the debt. But in general, the sort of cost to society is around maybe 3 or 4% of GDP in many cases. Exceptional cases like Argentina and Indonesia, cost to society maybe moving on to 50%. In Ireland, this is one of the top and biggest bailouts in world history of a banking industry in a very small country. So it's important to understand the insanity of what's happening. And what this is linked to is really probably the most vitriolic class war being pursued on a population by an elite who barely cover their traces. Barely cover their traces. I mean, one of the features of being a ruling class for decades is you learn to smooth things out and cover your traces. One of the sort of disadvantages for the Irish ruling class, if you like, is they don't even bother. So in some ways you couldn't make it up in terms of Marxism. It is so crude, the effort at launching the class war. Let me just take you a few examples. I mean, what shocks me, listening to RTE or the private radio stations, is the absolute, if you like, wall-to-wall pushing of a particular agenda, and because it's a small country, often by certain key figures who pretend to have an academic neutrality, but whose gusto for class war is unrivaled by people like Michael O'Leary. Take, for example, Mr. Jim O'Leary. By the way, I, as a Marxist, have no problem naming names, because I think social welfare recipients get named and brought in and so on. So I have no problem, when it comes to elites, naming names. It's nothing personal, it is to do with a class position. Take, for example, Jim O'Leary. Jim O'Leary, the Irish Times informed us last week, will play a major role in advising on the budgetary strategy. He was an economist, a professional economist, working for Maynooth University up to recently, but he's been seconded to the Department of Finance. Who was Jim O'Leary? Jim O'Leary is a man who condemns the trade unions for marching against Irish ferries, and who, from 2001, sat on the board of Allied Irish Bank and did not say a word. In other words, we have a bank director brought in to be a government advisor, framing a budget that's going to crucify working people in this country. You can't get any more crude than that. I have the sad misfortune to work alongside Colin McCarthy, an economist. Colin McCarthy, you know, academics develop new bits of language and jargon, and you might even get a peer-reviewed article if you do it well. Concept, double allowance. Have you ever heard the term double allowance before the McCarthy report? It refers to social welfare recipients who have one allowance, let's say a single parent's allowance, and who might have a back to education allowance. And that is terrible. That's a double allowance. But then we look at Mr. McCarthy. He's a professor in UCD, average salary 130,000, and he got commissioned to write a report, paid 35,000. I think that's a double allowance, to write a report attacking double allowances. You don't get any more cruder than this in this country. Or you look at Arthur Cox. The Controller and Auditor General has informed us that Arthur Cox, the advice we got, governments look for advice, that's how bourgeois governments do it these days. They have commissions, task forces, advice. They went to Arthur Cox for advice. They paid Arthur Cox $9 million for advice, which has brought this country to the verge of ruin. Except Arthur Cox was also the legal advisor for Bank of Ireland. So we have a legal advisor to the government, advising the government to recapitalise Bank of Ireland to the tune of $3.5 billion, while working as a legal advisor to Bank of Ireland. And when they put the whole scheme together, guess what? They get to be the legal advisor for NAMA. You can't make this stuff up. This is absolutely crude. It is no attempts to cover the traces. It is attempts to launch class warfare on people. And when we look, for example, at the type of schemes that have come here, NAMA. Again, if we look at how NAMA originated, normal pattern of bourgeois governments in this society is to have a commission, get a respected objective academic to front up that commission, and then they will produce a report, and of course you say, I accept the report. How was NAMA done? They did the same process. They appointed an accepted objective academic, Peter Bacon, economist, prominent economist, did a report on the housing industry here in 2001, except nobody told the Irish people that this man, after he completed the report on Irish housing, went on to work as the international director of Ballymore Properties, a company that bribed Liam Lawler. So if somebody presented as an objective expert doing a report on the housing industry who presided over massive speculation on housing, and not surprisingly, he comes up with a scheme called NAMA. One of the smaller prints that people don't notice is a provision for $5 billion to complete, if you like, uncompleted properties. And when you read the report, as I often read these reports, because I operate on the one thing that I think, if you like, Polanca's made that I thought was quite useful was, he says, you know, most information in bourgeois society is there. Just read the most boring things and you'll find it, right? So read the most boring things, you read these reports, and what you find is the logic of NAMA was that in 2000, I think it was 2008, the report was written, he says, who would give a loan to an Irish builder at the moment to complete, let's say, in Bacon's case, he was international director responsible for apartment blocks in Slovakia, who would give a loan to an Irish builder in Slovakia to complete the apartment blocks? Nobody was the answer. Therefore, the Irish state must leave aside $5 billion to help builders complete these properties. Now, one of the provisions of NAMA is that NAMA will only pursue assets that were transferred after 2009. A rather strange, this is according to the Irish Independent, rather strange provision. And we look at the pattern of what's been happening in the last year, and I've listed it there. Almost every single rich person who is responsible for massive debts has suddenly discovered women's liberation and is transferring their assets to their wives, or if you like, are moving property out of this country. If you take as a random example, because the Right to Work campaign, and you're all invited to come to it, on the 13th of November is marching to Shawnee Fitzpatrick's town, the best way of putting it, marching through Shawnee Fitzpatrick's town to make a very important political point. Shawnee Fitzpatrick has a pension of $9 million, tax subsidised under that particular scheme the wealthy people used in terms of tax funding, except that he has transferred $3.5 billion of that pension to his wife. He owns properties in Marbella. He owns properties in Smithfield and Dublin. He owns one house in Greystones, another house in Killiney, and part owner of another house in Bray. Why isn't his assets being seized? It's obvious. Why isn't his assets being seized? But this is the sort of mechanism, if you like, the crudity of what's happening in Ireland, that they simply transfer assets to their wives, take a legal challenge, nothing actually happens. So in that sense, therefore, the way the bank bailout and the properties dealers are being dealt with is of crudity in the extreme. Okay, the second area where Ireland, if you like, is very much an outlier, or if you like, an extreme, concentrated form of capitalism, is in its embrace of wage cuts. And here, I think it's important to say how this occurred. And if you go back to February 2009, IBEC made a pre-budget submission to the government where they stated in very clear terms, as only the powerful can, exactly what they wanted. They wanted a 10% cut in wages. And they used, essentially, the shock doctrine effect that people like Naomi Klein spoke of. In other words, that as people were demoralised, coming from one of the most successful booms in terms of global capitalism, although obviously in a smaller country, as people were disorientated, they moved and shifted the argument very quickly to the issue of wage cuts. And they found tremendous support from the academic establishment. Tremendous support from the academic establishment. In fact, the number of economists, I mean, bar probably Terry over there from NUIG, go up, the number of economists who've spoken out against the policy which, for example, Joseph Stiglitz has referred to as not heard of since the 1930s, when he was speaking about the East Asian economy crash in 1997. The number of economists who've spoken out, you can hardly count them, right? So the economic establishment have backed in immediately this demand for wage cuts. Okay, so in that sense, Ireland has been very much an outlier. The Irish model having a certain fascination for the ruling class up to about August of this year, and if you like, from the point of view of the left, a quandary presented. How could it happen? How do they get away with it so often? And I think that the dilemma that the left has at the moment is understanding that on one hand we are a minority that I think whose message has a lot of relevance to our society, but if you like, on also understanding why is it that our fellow citizens and our fellow workers, instead of embracing, if you like, any of the left message, appear at this point, I think it's a bit more deceptive than that, not to be in, certainly, if you like, putting a major opposition to this. And I think that if you like, I think that leads to demoralisation. So therefore you get this negative dialectic where people become aware of what's going on in society and then frustrated because they cannot convince other sections of the population, and that, if you like, frustration in turn demoralising them, so that when, if you like, struggle comes, often the left is demoralised. So I want to argue that that arises from a limited understanding of crashes and how crashes affect working class consciousness. It is not the case, or it's not the case except in the most mechanical forms of Marxism, that a crash always equals a revolt. In fact, it's not the case. If you look at the period in the Wall Street crash, it is not the case that American workers, after 1929, saw through capitalism and began to revolt. In fact, the period of the revolts in America start really from the mid to later 1930s, 1932, 1933 onwards. There's a whole period, 3 or 4 years, of shock before people begin to grapple with what's happening and, if you like, begin to organise themselves for revolt. And I think that the Russian Marxist Trotsky put it very well. He says that it's really how you enter the crisis. It's not the crisis itself. It's not the scale of the crisis that suddenly wakens up working class consciousness. It's under what conditions does a particular working class enter a crisis. And when we look at the conditions in which they were, because I think we do have to explain why aren't the working class in Ireland in revolt against the scale of it. And I think that it's only about understanding that it's not, if you like, a mechanical relationship between the scale of the crisis and political reaction. I think we'll begin to get a grip on it. So I want to argue there are two factors, if you like, explaining why there has not been a major revolt of Irish workers over the last period. The first is what I call the naive capitalism that accompanied the Celtic Tiger, popular naive capitalism that accompanied the Celtic Tiger, and the second is social partnership. What do I mean by the culture of naive capitalism? Well, if we take, for example, that wonderful weather vane of Irish life, David McWilliams, I mean, David McWilliams is, by the way, I mean, he's very good in his criticism of the crisis at the moment, but at the high point of the boom, the discourse from David McWilliams was that, in fact, Ireland was going to be the new Venice. That if you like, the Venice of the North, having a particular role, a niche in the global economy, and that, if you like, through this, Ireland would become a middle-class nation, whereby class divisions would be overcome. And, you know, you get that sort of repressed, or rather formerly repressed nationalism began to come back to the surface under the Celtic Tiger years, and you see that this is McWilliams writing about the Irish rich in South Africa. You know, the Irish rich, they get a bit annoyed if somebody calls them boss. They have this sort of gut feeling for the downtrodden, combined with the bank balance of the overlord. And that really summed up the sort of notion of, you know, this was a good little country, we were getting it right, and that culture, I think, pervaded Irish society. And if you like, that was the experience, particularly, which many young people grew up with, this image of Ireland at this particular point in time. And of course, again, in terms of the universities, it was backed up to the hilt by the academic establishment in the university. I often focus on the ESRI because I think that they are the voice of official academic establishment in this country, the official intelligentsia at the service of capital. If you look at the ESRI, they produced a book, The Social Impact of the Celtic Tiger, really to answer some of the critics that had begun to talk about inequality, where they said the housing system has performed well in sheer volumes of new houses it has produced. The prediction there from, you can read the prediction from the same John Fitzgerald, who's telling us that wage cuts are good for us. He was predicting, this is his prediction for 2009, that's last year, there should have been 24,000 extra jobs created. There was in fact 400,000, I think, gone the other way, but doesn't stop him coming back again saying we need more wage cuts. So this academic establishment presented a very uncritical view of the Celtic Tiger. And if you look at this sort of Olympian writer, Roy Foster, I mean, anybody who criticised the Celtic Tiger was not being modern. So modernity was linked to the Celtic Tiger, and only, if you like, fundamentalists and traditionalists and people who were worried about ruthless cosmopolitanism, very redundant phrase, were against the Celtic Tiger. So this was, if you like, the culture that was deliberately created in the Celtic Tiger years. And it had many aspects to it. I mean, first of all, a complete ignorance about the fact that global capitalism has been built on a series of economic miracles. Chile, for example, in the late 70s, Italy, the Sorpasso, there's been a whole series of miracles. And it was as if the Irish miracle was the first miracle that ever happened in terms of global capitalism. There was an extraordinary belief that because, if you like, we are a young society, that in itself will create demand and ensure the boom continues for a long time. And really what I think was being presented here was a sort of a moral view of capitalism, that if you play the market and you do what's right and, if you like, follow the market, then you get rewards, if you like, a secular morality that went with the Celtic Tiger years. And lastly, I think, ironically, Ireland's history of oppression, of being colonised. People often think that because you've been oppressed, you automatically become left-wing. Not the case. Oppression can work in various ways, in various complex ways, but Ireland's history of oppression fed back into this naive culture. You know, that we were oppressed, we were underdeveloped, so we have every right to be a tax haven. We have every right to help people dodge taxes because it's the way that Ireland will join the nations of the world on equal terms. So this culture was deep, it was all pervasive, and this culture, therefore, a working class, particularly younger people, if you like, being brought up in this culture, facing a crisis, if you like, has an impact in terms of how you respond. I'll skip, I won't go on about economists anymore. The second area, I think, is the issue of social partnership, right? And here you cannot really explain the responses to the crisis in terms of the working class without coming to grips with the question of social partnership. Social partnership has been a disaster for the Irish working class. And I put it very simply. If you ask yourself, in the 2 years, the question, why haven't the Irish protested? Well, one answer is, who invited them to protest? Who invited them to protest? Where have been the occasions in which the Irish working population have been invited to come in large numbers as a working class to protest about what's going on? I can name two. February 24th, public sector workers, weekend march, November, I think it was the November march as well. And the reason for that is that social partnership led to an ideology where a section of the union movement, not a section, a considerable, particularly in the South, embraced the notion of competitiveness and effectively aligned the unions with the dominant neoliberal policies of this country with suitable, vague, vacuous covering, such as rhetoric about social exclusion. But on the substance, the unions were aligned with the dominant neoliberal elite. Two examples. Public-private partnerships. British unions are against public-private partnerships. They're a way of ripping off the taxpayer. Irish unions, if you like, support or do not oppose public-private partnerships. Most even social democratic formations in Europe are for state provision of creches. The official position of the Irish Union movement is for tax breaks in order so individuals can have private arrangements in terms of childcare. So social partnership had a dreadful effect in terms of Irish unions. And when we look at the scandal about the HSE funding, what was it about? This is from the Irish Times. It wasn't about helping, if you like, the lower paid upskill. It was about a classic managerial strategy of team building, except the team you're building with are the leaders of Labour, and as was explained, it was an effort. The reason why people were taken on junkets to New York and Savannah was to build a links with those people so that they in turn would understand the need for reform in the health service. This is the tragedy of what social partnership led to. And it was a tragedy in terms of union membership. This is the figures for union membership. Absolutely shocking levels of decline. People were told social partnership will safeguard the unions. It won't, if you like, allow the sort of new right offensive that began in Britain. You look at the actual figures, the facts of the matter are that if you look at the figure, let's take the beginning of the Celtic Tiger, 53%, figure union density shrunk to 32%. Even more than that, the effects of social partnership gave an opening to the elite forces in Ireland to present the issue in terms of their strategy as public sector versus private sector. Because the reality is that union membership is now dramatically concentrated in the public sector. And if you look at, for example, the foreign direct investment sector in particular, union membership is even lower there. Sorry, that should be 11%, not 21%. Okay, so what this has produced, therefore, is a union bureaucracy that is wedded to a notion of competitiveness in an economy going into decline, and whose primary focus now is what I would call the great fear. The great fear that, given the frustrations building up in Irish society, that how are we going to manage this, and how are we, if you like, bring it into safe channels. And the strategy of the union leaders of this country is to only have token protests to create a space for the Labour Party to emerge as a major party in terms of Irish politics, and not to build up expectations on that Labour Party, because Labour in Ireland will do exactly what Labour in Greece did. It will talk left before the election, and as soon as they come under pressure from bondholders and the wealthy, it will cave in, I believe, within a month. Okay, so given all that, that's I think the context in which, when we say it's not the Irish psyche, it's not that the Irish people have a different psyche to the French. There are real, if you like, social factors, political and social factors, that explain the lack of revolt in Ireland. Therefore, we have to ask, if the revolt hasn't happened, when will it happen? When will there be a revolt? And here again, I think we have to break from mechanical Marxism. The answer is we don't know. I don't know. I don't think there's an automatic relationship between a crisis and, if you like, revolt. I think there will be. I think it'll happen sometime. There'll be some forms of revolt, but I don't think it's automatic. But what I do think is important to grasp is that the crisis in Ireland, and indeed in terms of global capitalism, is going to be long and protracted. And that is, whatever happens, it is going to delegitimise the political establishment and create enormous space for left-wing ideas. And how that space develops, it depends on all sorts of factors. It depends on whether or not the left is able to develop networks of resistance, whether we are able to bring people together against bus cuts, against cuts in public services, and the left actually moves out of, if you like, relatively small group circles into giving a lead in terms of networks of resistance. It will come through the emergence of newer political forces. I believe there will be splits, divisions, all sorts of things will emerge in this period, because we're in for a long, protracted crisis where the left will get a chance to, if you like, will be tested certainly, and will get a chance to deal with the issues. Okay, why do I say a long and protracted crisis? Because the fascination with the Irish model, as I said, lasted until about August of this year. And if you look at the tone of the international press, and I'll take, for example, the Financial Times as a mouthpiece for the international press, they have become far more critical of the Irish model since around August, September of this year, as it became clear, really, how the state strategy was unravelling. How is the state strategy unravelling? Capitalism is a system whereby investment, capital, are controlled by a small minority. And therefore the health of any capitalist economy depends on their confidence to invest. That's the base of capitalism. Do they actually decide to invest for profit, not for human need? And when we look at the Irish, if you like, the Irish crash, what we find is a continual decline in investment. The capitalists are not investing in Ireland because they have no confidence that this economy is able to provide them with the type of return. Secondly, we find that the strategy in terms of the banking industry, which was originally premised on saving, for example, Allied Irish Bank, has fallen apart. So their strategy is falling apart on front after front. When we look at the, if you like, the most stated objective of the economic strategy, it was balance the books, whatever else, balance the books, because through balancing the books, we will cut down on interest payments on foreign borrowing. 2 years afterwards, the interest payments are higher than before the strategy began. So the strategy has fallen apart. I think it's important to understand that. For all, if you like, the feelings of demoralisation can exist on the left, the strategy pursued by the elite in this country in terms of their own agenda in the crisis is falling apart. And lastly, I want to just highlight why the global context is important. And here we have to understand that what's happening in Ireland, the protracted nature of the crisis, is a feature of what's happening in global capitalism, and that will also have a tremendous impact for us. Okay, in as brief a period as possible, let me try to outline a few elements of that argument. Marx argued in his Capital, he says that the tendency for the rate of profit to fall in every respect is the most important law of modern political economy, and despite its simplicity, it has never before been grasped. And what he meant was that the proportion of labour, if you like, which is the source of surplus value, the proportion of labour to capital, the ratio had begun to decline over a period with detrimental effects on the rate of profit. The rate of Marx's prediction was the rate of profit, there were many countervailing tendencies, and those countervailing tendencies, it's necessary to analyse them, and so on, but the rate of profit would tend to, over a period, decline. And we look at figures in terms of the rate of profit in manufacturing industry. In broadly speaking, you can check out literature from people like Dumonil and Levy. The rate of profit in the advanced industrial economies in manufacturing had begun to decline over the longer period, particularly since the 50s. Now, how do capitalists respond to this? And here, so we look at the question of the countervailing tendencies that Marx had talked about. And he argues that one way of responding to this, if the proportion of labour to capital, and labour being the source of profit, has declined, one way of compensating for that is through intensifying labour, through, if you like, eliminating downtime, through, if you like, getting more out of the smaller number of workers in producing more surplus value. So intensification of labour will be one of the features of which Marx himself talked about in terms of responding to this crisis. However, a second way of responding to crisis, which is an innovation really of late capitalism, is if you, and there's obviously an aspect to it, if you push down wages to a certain extent, you do have the problem over a period, if capitalism is a very dynamic system, producing ever more and more goods, how does the working class market begin to, if you like, buy those goods? And one of the mechanisms that was, if you like, been invented in the last decade or so has been the invention of working class debt. Working class debt has become a phenomenon in most, if you like, capitalist countries. And that phenomenon in turn is linked to a third phenomenon, which is the question of financialisation. The growing proportion of capitalism, particularly in America and the advanced economies, linked to the financial sector. Now, I think there's problems with the analysis of financialisation if it's taken out of the context of the falling rate of profit, of the wider developments in the capitalist economy. But when we look at the pattern, I mean, the general pattern in America, here's the figures in terms of productivity and labour. And you find this gap between the wages in America, which has been essentially flatlining, and growing productivity. That gap has increasingly been filled by working class debt, people borrowing at vast amounts. If you look, for example, at the figures from Merrill Lynch argued that half of the US growth came in, for example, the growth, the boom of the first boom of the 21st century, essentially that was stimulated by domestic demand, increasingly stimulated by borrowing. And borrowing linked to an asset price bubble in terms of housing. And if you like, if you like, the deal for late capitalism, which is sometimes summarized in the phrase China America, is that workers in China paid approximately $60, $70 a month. A huge proportion of their savings, so-called savings, is recycled through the American credit system, which in turn allows American workers to borrow quite a lot to meet the gap I was talking about and to buy Chinese export goods. And that, if you like, in very simple and broad terms, was a major role of the in terms of the last boom, the American-led boom. And what that was linked to was a growing financialization of American capitalism. In 1960, for example, about 16% of the profits of corporate America come from finance. By the end of this last period, before the crash, nearly 40% of the profits of corporate America was coming from finance. Now, these features of capitalism, I think it's important to understand them to understand really what's in store for Ireland. But before, if you like, dealing with what's in store for Ireland, let's deal with briefly the latest ideological explanation of why the crash happened. And this explanation focuses on the notion of crony capitalism. And it's an all-pervasive explanation. It is that the reason why there's a crash in Ireland is because they were all cronies. And this is the explanation, for example, of David McWilliams. You know, his first half of his play, brilliant indictment of Irish capitalism. Then he moves on to the explanation, and the explanation is that we had too much crony capitalism and not enough capitalism, right? And Finch O'Toole, in my view, makes certain concessions to this argument, believing possibly we could have a more regulated capitalism, obviously not putting in the same category as David McWilliams. But the notion is it's not capitalism that has caused the problem, it has been a particular feature of capitalism, for example in Ireland, crony capitalism. And this explanation was a standard explanation, by the way, of the East Asian tiger collapse in 1997. East Asian tigers, wonderful model for capitalism, and then we get the crash. How are we going to explain it? The answer, they're all cronies. They're all crony capitalism in these countries. Bring in the IMF, push in more neoliberal measures. So it's the same pattern that is being presented here. And I think we have to argue that is not the case. Ireland is a miniature, an extreme version of patterns of capitalism that exist in America. It is not as if this place is more unusually a crony form of capitalism compared to America. I mean, I can deal with the crony argument in America very simply. The American government, I think, had Henry Paulson from Goldman Sachs, and then before that it had Robert Reich from Goldman Sachs, and then you had, what's that odious man, Dick Cheney from Halliburton, and we're not supposed to be cronies in America. Of course, capitalism is not a system built on atomized actors, if you like, performing a play from the mythology of the market. It is built on networks in which the state plays a huge role in global capitalism. And when we talk about cronyism, we mean the links between private capital and the state apparatus. And that exists in America as much as it exists in Ireland. But when we look more precisely, you find that the features of Ireland, in many ways, in many awesome ways, in miniature and in extreme, resemble some of the features of late capitalism generally. That's not to equate Ireland and America or say Ireland is the same sort of imperialist power as America, simply to look at some of the more general features. This country, for example, is a country now built essentially on finance. 14% of the workforce in finance, 13%. So that is in a hurry. 14% in finance, 13% in manufacturing. Very high levels of personal debt. When we look at this sort of usual discourse, we got this crisis because Patrick Neary fell asleep at the wheel. Yeah, but it was the philosophy of global capitalism to fall asleep at the wheel, because the philosophy was you don't need regulation. By a certain magic, you can put a finger on risk, you can quantify risk, and then you can sell risk. That was the philosophy of global capitalism. It wasn't the philosophy of Patrick Neary. Okay, and therefore, this is, if you like, what is happening in Ireland. It's a feature of global capitalism. And I've been asked to finish. And I'll finish on this. Why will the crash be protracted? Because the other feature of late capitalism, again as Marx pointed out, the horror of the system is that it needs crashes. It needs, after a period, to, if you like, devalue capital, as Morris Dobb put it many years ago, it needs a catharsis where capitalism is destroyed in order for to get that system going again. The problem of late capitalism is because of, if you like, concentration, because of the vast level of monopoly, they are not able to, if you like, let vast chunks of capital go down unless they would bring other forms of capital with them. So this, if you like, feature is going to mean we have a long, protracted crisis, some features of recovery, but a long, protracted crisis in terms of global capitalism. And lastly, I don't think global capitalism can do the type of geopolitical arrangements that people like Martin Wolf argues for, if you like, a rebalancing between China and America, mainly because of the decline of American hegemony and the growing rivalries between China and America. Okay, to sum up therefore, we are in a period where the elites of the world have a problem with the global system, if you like, the mechanisms of capitalism, the horrible mechanisms of capitalism, if you like, are unable to, if you like, bring back the type of recovery that existed even in the 90s. So we're in for a protracted period of, if you like, crisis and difficulties of capitalism. We are living at a country which is at the edge of that, and whatever weakness there exists in the working class, those who run the society are deeply fearful of what is in future for the left. And therefore I believe the future for the left is understanding that it's a protracted crisis rather than, if you like, dismissing and thinking that the working class in Ireland are not like the French and we can't do anything, we should all really emigrate to France.